The North Atlantic, February 1943. The water was black as oil and the cold cut through everything. On the deck of a German U-boat, a young sailor named Klaus Richter stood watch, his hands trembling not from the temperature but from what he had just witnessed. 3 hours earlier, his submarine had encountered a convoy of Allied merchant ships. The attack had been swift and brutal. Now, as he stared at the debris floating in the moonlight, he could still hear the screams of the drowning men, their cries mixing with the wind. Klaus was 22 years old, and this was his first patrol. Nothing in his training had prepared him for the weight of what he had seen. Klaus had grown up in Hamburg, the son of a schoolteacher and a dock worker. He remembered his father taking him to the harbor as a child, showing him the massive ships that connected Germany to the world. His father had always spoken of the sea with reverence, as something that united people, not divided them. But now, standing on this submarine, Klaus felt only division. The commander had called the attack a victory, had even distributed extra rations to celebrate, but Klaus couldn't eat. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the faces of the men in the water, reaching up toward a sky that offered no salvation. The submarine's mission was to intercept Allied supply lines crossing the Atlantic. For months, German U-boats had been devastating these convoys, sinking hundreds of ships and strangling Britain's lifeline. The strategy was working, but it came at a cost that Klaus was only beginning to understand. In the cramped quarters below deck, he listened to his fellow sailors joke and play cards, their laughter echoing off the metal walls. Some of them were hardened veterans who had made this voyage dozens of times. Others, like Klaus, were new recruits, still learning to navigate the terror and boredom of submarine warfare. If you're finding this story compelling, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us bring more untold stories from history to life. The submarine was called U-584, and it was part of a wolf pack hunting Allied convoys in the mid-Atlantic. The commander, Kapitän Leutnant Werner Hartmann, was a decorated officer with 12 confirmed kills. He ran his boat with iron discipline, demanding absolute obedience and rewarding success with small privileges. Hartmann was not a cruel man, but he was a product of his training and his time. He believed in the mission, believed in the righteousness of Germany's cause, and believed that weakness was the greatest sin a sailor could commit. Klaus both admired and feared him. On the third day after the convoy attack, the submarine received new orders. They were to rendezvous with a supply ship near the Azores, refuel, and then proceed to a new hunting ground further south. The crew was excited by the news. A rendezvous meant fresh food, mail from home, and perhaps a few hours of relative safety on the surface. Klaus felt the mood lighten around him, heard the men talking about letters they hoped to receive, about sweethearts and families waiting in ports thousands of miles away. He tried to share their enthusiasm, but the images from the convoy attack refused to leave him. That night, Klaus volunteered for radio watch. It was a quiet duty that gave him time alone, away from the cramped sleeping quarters and the constant presence of other men. The radio room was barely large enough for one person, filled with equipment that hummed and crackled with static. Klaus sat before the receivers, adjusting frequencies and listening to the endless chatter of coded messages flowing across the Atlantic. Most of it was routine, position reports and weather updates, encoded in ciphers that he couldn't break. But sometimes, in the gaps between transmissions, he would hear voices speaking in English, American and British sailors talking to their bases, their words clear and unguarded. He wasn't supposed to listen to these transmissions. His orders were to monitor German frequencies only, to watch for messages directed at U-584. But Klaus found himself tuning into the Allied channels, listening to the enemy speak. They talked about the same things German sailors talked about. They complained about the food, joked about their officers, expressed longing for home. They were not the monsters that propaganda had described. They were men, just like him, caught in the machinery of a war they did not fully understand. One night, as Klaus sat in the radio room, he heard something that made his blood freeze. It was a British transmission, partially encrypted, but with enough clear text that he could piece together the meaning. The message referenced a specific grid coordinate in the North Atlantic, a location where Allied intelligence had detected increased U-boat activity. But what caught Klaus's attention was the mention of a new anti-submarine weapon, something the British called a hedgehog, a forward-throwing depth-charge system that was proving devastatingly effective against submarines. The transmission included technical details, ranges, and deployment patterns, information that could save German lives if it reached the right people. Klaus sat motionless, his hand hovering over the log where he was supposed to record all significant transmissions. His duty was clear. Any intelligence about enemy capabilities had to be reported immediately to the commander. But something held him back. If he reported this, if he gave Hartmann this information, it would make the submarine more effective, more deadly. It would mean more convoys attacked, more ships sunk, more men drowning in the freezing Atlantic. Klaus thought about his father, about the man who had taught him that the sea connected people. He thought about the screams he still heard in his sleep. For 3 days, Klaus kept the information to himself. He told no one about the transmission, filed no report, pretended it had never happened, but the knowledge weighed on him like a stone. He became withdrawn, spoke less to his fellow sailors, spent more time staring at the walls of the submarine. The other men noticed the change, but attributed it to the stress of combat, the normal adjustment period that every new sailor went through. Only the submarine's doctor, an older man named Friedrich Weber, seemed to sense that something deeper was troubling Klaus. Dr. Weber had served on U-boats since the beginning of the war. He had seen hundreds of young men pass through these steel tubes, had watched them transform from idealistic recruits into hardened veterans or broken shells. He had learned to read the signs of psychological distress, to distinguish between normal fear and something more dangerous. One afternoon, as Klaus sat alone in the mess area, Weber approached him with 2 cups of ersatz coffee and sat down without asking permission. "We all see things that stay with us," Weber said quietly, his eyes studying Klaus's face. "The question is what we do with those memories." Klaus looked at the doctor, wanting to speak, wanting to confess everything, but fear held his tongue. Weber continued, his voice low enough that no one else could hear. "I've been on 6 boats," he said. "I've watched 3 of them sink. I've pulled men from the water and watched them die in my hands. And I've learned that the hardest part of this war is not the enemy outside, it's the enemy inside ourselves, the part that questions everything we've been told to believe." Klaus felt something break inside him. The words came pouring out in a whisper. The story of the transmission, the information about the Allied anti-submarine weapons, his decision to keep it secret. Weber listened without interruption, his face showing no judgment, only a deep weariness that seemed to age him before Klaus's eyes. When Klaus finished, Weber was silent for a long moment, staring into his coffee as if reading omens in the dark liquid. "You've put yourself in an impossible position," Weber finally said. "If you report this now, Hartmann will ask why you waited. If you don't report it, and we encounter these weapons, men will die who might have been saved." Klaus felt tears burning his eyes. "What should I do?" he asked. Weber looked at him with something like compassion. "I can't answer that for you," he said, "but I can tell you this. Every man on this boat believes he's fighting for something good, something worth the sacrifice. But war has a way of proving that belief wrong, slowly, piece by piece. The question you have to ask yourself is who you want to be when this is all over, what you want to see when you look in the mirror." That night, as the submarine cruised beneath the surface, Klaus made his decision. He would not report the intelligence about the Allied weapons, but he would do something more dangerous, something that could get him executed if discovered. He would find a way to sabotage the submarine's effectiveness, to ensure that U-584 would not be able to attack as many convoys, would not be able to kill as many men. It was a betrayal of everything he had been taught, a violation of his oath as a German sailor. But it felt like the only way to preserve something of his humanity, to stop being complicit in horrors he could no longer justify. His opportunity came 2 weeks later, when the submarine suffered a minor mechanical failure in one of its diesel engines. Klaus, who had training as an engine mechanic before joining the Navy, volunteered to assist with the repairs. Working in the cramped engine room, surrounded by the deafening roar of machinery, Klaus carefully loosened several critical bolts on the fuel injection system, not enough to cause immediate failure, but enough to ensure that the engine would become unreliable under stress. It was a small act of sabotage, almost invisible, but it would have consequences. Over the following weeks, the submarine's performance deteriorated. The damaged engine required constant maintenance, forcing the boat to surface more frequently and reducing its operational range. Hartmann became increasingly frustrated, ordering repeated inspections but finding nothing obviously wrong. The other mechanics, including Klaus, examined every component, tightened every connection, but the problems persisted. What they didn't know was that Klaus was continuously and subtly undoing any repairs that might restore full functionality. The submarine's reduced effectiveness did not go unnoticed by command. U-584 was reassigned from frontline convoy hunting to a reconnaissance role, patrolling shipping lanes and reporting Allied movements rather than engaging directly. For Hartmann, it was a humiliation. For Klaus, it was a partial redemption. The submarine was still part of the war machine, but it was no longer sinking ships, no longer sending men to their deaths. Klaus told himself it was enough, that he had done what he could. But fate, as it often does in war, had other plans. In April 1943, while patrolling near the Azores, U-584 encountered a lone American destroyer conducting anti-submarine operations. The destroyer detected the submarine's presence and immediately began an attack. Hartmann ordered an emergency dive, pushing the boat to its maximum depth, as depth charges exploded around them. The submarine shuddered with each detonation, lights flickering, men thrown against bulkheads. Klaus held onto a pipe as the world tilted and spun. metal groaning under impossible pressure. The attack lasted 20 minutes, though it felt like hours. When it finally ended, when the destroyer moved away, and the sound of its propellers faded into silence, the submarine was badly damaged. The hull had multiple leaks, the electrical system was failing, and worst of all, the damaged engine had finally given up completely. Hartman ordered the crew to attempt emergency repairs, but even he could see the situation was desperate. They were too deep to surface safely, losing battery power and taking on water. The submarine was dying, and everyone aboard knew it. In the chaos, Dr. Weber found Klaus in the engine room, frantically working alongside other mechanics to contain the flooding. Weber pulled him aside, his face grim. "Whatever you did," he said quietly, "whatever you've been doing, it's brought us to this." Klaus felt the accusation like a physical blow, but Weber wasn't finished. "We're going to have to surface," he continued. "We're going to have to surrender, and when we do, you're going to have a choice to make." The submarine surfaced just after dawn, wallowing in heavy seas, its deck awash with spray. The American destroyer was waiting, its guns trained on the stricken U-boat. Through a bullhorn, an American officer ordered the German crew to abandon ship and prepare to be taken prisoner. Hartman, his face a mask of fury and despair, gave the command. His men, exhausted and terrified, began emerging from the hatches, their hands raised in surrender. Klaus came up last, blinking in the sudden brightness, feeling the wind on his face for the first time in weeks. As American sailors came alongside in small boats to collect the German prisoners, Klaus made his decision. He approached the American officer in charge, a young lieutenant named James Morrison, and spoke in halting English. "I have information," Klaus said, "about German submarine operations, about our codes and procedures." Morrison looked at him skeptically, but something in Klaus's eyes convinced him to listen. Other German sailors, including Hartman, were already being loaded into the boats, but Morrison gestured for Klaus to wait, to stay behind for a moment. In that brief interval, standing on the deck of his dying submarine, Klaus told Morrison everything. He described the communication codes used by U-boats, the rendezvous procedures with supply ships, the patrol patterns and hunting tactics. He explained the weaknesses in German submarine design, the points where depth charges were most effective. And he mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that he had overheard a transmission about a new German weapon being developed, something called an acoustic torpedo that could home in on a ship's propeller sounds, a weapon that could revolutionize submarine warfare if deployed successfully. Morrison listened intently, occasionally asking questions, his initial skepticism fading as he realized the value of what he was hearing. When Klaus finished, Morrison was silent for a moment, then nodded slowly. "You realize what this means," he said. "Your own people will consider you a traitor." Klaus looked back at the submarine, at his fellow sailors being loaded into boats, at Hartman's distant figure radiating contempt. "I know," he said quietly, "but maybe that's what I need to be." Klaus was separated from the other prisoners and taken directly to the United States for interrogation. Over the following months, he provided Allied intelligence with detailed information about German naval operations, information that helped turn the tide in the Battle of the Atlantic. The intelligence about acoustic torpedoes led to the development of countermeasures that saved countless Allied ships. The submarine codes Klaus revealed allowed the British to refine their decryption efforts, making convoy routing more effective. His testimony was one piece in a larger puzzle, but it was a significant piece. The other sailors from U-584, including Hartman, were sent to a prisoner of war camp in Canada. Klaus never saw them again, but he heard stories. Hartman had denounced him in front of the other prisoners, called him a coward and a betrayer. Some of the men from his submarine wanted him killed if they ever found him. Klaus accepted this judgment. He understood that, from their perspective, he had committed the ultimate sin, had chosen the enemy over his comrades. But he also knew that he had chosen to stop being part of a machine that created suffering, and that choice, however imperfect, was one he could live with. The war continued for 2 more years, and Klaus spent that time in a strange limbo, neither prisoner nor free man. The Americans treated him well, but kept him isolated, worried that other German prisoners might harm him if his cooperation became known. He spent his days being interviewed by intelligence officers, his nights alone in a small room, wrestling with the consequences of his choices. Sometimes he wondered if he had done the right thing. Other times he was certain he had simply traded one form of guilt for another. When the war finally ended in May 1945, Klaus faced a new dilemma. He could not return to Germany, where he would certainly be prosecuted as a traitor. The United States offered him the opportunity to remain in America, to start a new life in a country that was not his own. He accepted, partly because he had no choice, partly because the idea of beginning again, of shedding the weight of his past, held a seductive appeal. He was given a new identity, new papers, and a small amount of money. He moved to a coastal town in Massachusetts, found work at a shipyard, and tried to build something resembling a normal life. For decades, Klaus kept his story to himself. He married an American woman, had 2 children, worked honest labor repairing fishing boats and small cargo vessels. He learned to speak English without an accent, adopted American customs, became in most ways indistinguishable from his neighbors. But the past never fully released him. At night, he still dreamed of the submarine, of the men drowning in the Atlantic, of Hartman's contemptuous face as they parted. And sometimes, reading about the war in newspapers or history books, he would see references to the intelligence breakthroughs that helped defeat the U-boats, and he would know that he had played a small part in that victory. In his 70s, after his wife passed away, Klaus began to write down his story. He didn't intend to publish it, didn't want recognition or vindication. He simply wanted to understand his own life, to make sense of the impossible choices he had faced. He wrote about growing up in Hamburg, about his father's love of the sea, about the submarine and the convoy attack that had changed everything. He wrote about Weber, the doctor who had shown him that doubt was not weakness, but a form of wisdom. And he wrote about the moment on the surface when he had chosen to betray his country in order to remain true to himself. Klaus died in 2003 at the age of 82. His children, going through his belongings, found the manuscript hidden in a drawer. They read it with amazement and some discomfort, learning for the first time about their father's past, about the secret he had carried for more than half a century. After long discussions, they decided to share the story with a historian who verified the essential facts and placed Klaus's account in the larger context of the war. The historian noted that Klaus Richter was one of thousands of individuals on both sides of the conflict who faced moral dilemmas that had no clear answers, who tried to maintain their humanity in circumstances designed to destroy it. The story of Klaus Richter raises uncomfortable questions about loyalty and betrayal, about the difference between following orders and following conscience. Was he a traitor to his country, or was he loyal to a higher principle? Did his actions save lives, or did they simply make him feel better about his own complicity? There are no easy answers, and perhaps that's the point. War creates situations where good people are forced to make terrible choices, where every option carries a cost that can never be fully calculated or repaid. What is clear is that Klaus lived with the consequences of his choice for the rest of his life. He never sought forgiveness from his former comrades, never tried to justify himself to those who called him a traitor. He simply tried to live in a way that honored the decision he had made, that proved he had chosen not out of cowardice, but out of a stubborn refusal to participate in horrors he could not accept. In the end, that may be all any of us can do, to make the best choice we can with the information we have, and then live with the consequences as honestly as possible. The North Atlantic is empty now of submarines and convoys, empty of the desperate battles that once raged across its surface, but the waves still carry echoes of those days, memories of the men who fought and died there, of the impossible choices they faced. Klaus Richter was one of those men, neither hero nor villain, simply a human being trying to navigate the storm. His story reminds us that war is not just about nations and strategies, but about individuals wrestling with questions that have no good answers, only choices that must be made and then carried forward into whatever future remains. The manuscript Klaus left behind ends with a single sentence written in his careful handwriting. "I do not know if I was right, but I know I could not have lived with myself if I had done nothing." It is as honest an epitaph as any man could ask for, an acknowledgement of doubt paired with a refusal to surrender to despair. And perhaps that is the real lesson of his story, that maintaining our humanity in inhuman circumstances requires not certainty but courage, not righteousness, but the willingness to act according to our conscience even when the cost is everything we thought we valued. Klaus Richter paid that cost, and in doing so, he changed not just the war but himself, transforming from a frightened young sailor into someone who could look at his reflection without turning away.